Everybody to this Legitimate Leadership webinar. It is very exciting to have so many people join us. We started this particular journey in April, which was shortly after the coronavirus pandemic sent organizations around the world into a bit of free fall. And we were really intrigued because at that point our client base was mostly trying to save their businesses and save their people. And we were intrigued as to what people were actually doing out there and how their people were responding. And one of the questions we were asking ourselves is, has the work that we've done over the last few years really made any difference and prepared organizations for this crisis? So that is in fact a question that I am going to pose to our clients, to people who were involved in this exercise, in this diagnostic exercise, at the end. Did you find this helpful? Were there insights that came out? Do you think that this framework prepared you for the crisis? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that at the end. Before we get there, though, obviously it's going to be interesting to share the insights from this work. We spoke to nearly 300 people across organizations in 3 different regions, and using probably 10 of our associates and interviewers to support with that process. 2 people who were part of that interview process have joined us today. One of them is Wendy, who is on the screen next to me here. Wendy is the founder of Legitimate Leadership and was integral to this process. And then we're also being joined today by Josh, who's an associate with Legitimate Leadership and who was also a large part of doing the interviews and compiling the reports. So welcome, Wendy and Josh. It's nice to have you online. And hopefully I will stay online throughout if our power stays on for that long, which will be great. Right. I would like to, before I hand over to Josh, I'm going to ask Josh to share the insights, and then I'm going to ask Wendy to share the Legitimate Leadership perspective. But I'd like to take you through what is the overall exercise and what are the overall results. And I invite questions as we go along. So please write questions into the chat or put your hand up and stop me. I am going to ask Dave as well in case I miss anything. Dave Stevens is also on the line helping us. Dave, if any questions come up that I've missed, please just put your hand up, let me know, etc. Right. Okay, the report that we're going to show details the exercise that we did. As I mentioned, we made the decision to do this in April this year, and we executed these interviews between May and July. We conducted 282 interviews in total in 16 organizations and across 7 industries. We talked to managers and non-managers, almost half and half. We spoke to people who are working from home. We spoke to people who are working on site. The interviews themselves were structured and they lasted between 30 and 45 minutes. And we spoke to all sorts of organizations, from very small companies to corporates, from unionized environments to non-unionized environments. So it was really quite interesting to see what everyone had to say. And we did this in 7 industries. Mining and manufacturing was one of them, financial services, IT, health, tourism, biotech, and not-for-profits. Right. We asked 6 questions primarily. We tried to get information about 6 things. The first was this question of, has management focused on people or results during the crisis? And there we allowed people to respond with, yes, we've had a total focus on people. We focused on people and results. We've had a conditional focus on people for the results that they produce, or we believe that actually all we've cared about is results. So it was really interesting to see what people had to say there. We also asked about how trust has changed as a result of how leaders have responded in this crisis. And we've also looked at how that relates back to the original research on which this Legitimate Leadership framework was founded in the 1980s. Right. We then spoke to how aligned leaders are with the Legitimate Leadership criteria of care and growth, and Josh will speak about that in a little bit as well. We spoke to whether leaders are collaborating effectively with one another. What does team look like on site? And then we spoke to this question of, and I think some of the most interesting insights came out when we asked people, what have you observed from leaders? Has anybody really stood out for you? What has been exceptional? So we'll share some of those findings later. And then lastly, what are your expectations of leaders going forward? Which I think will be really helpful to some of the leaders on the line as you plan and navigate your path out of this crisis, which incidentally might be a more difficult one to navigate than the path into the crisis for various reasons that we'll talk about. The overall view, which is on the next slide, shows how organizations, and these are our client organizations, fared in this crisis. The -10 score is people were strongly disagreeing with the statement, and the +10 score is the people strongly agreeing. We would argue that anything above a 5 is really nothing to worry about. Anything between a 0 and a 5 would be, there's room for improvement, but it is still positive. And as you can see, leaders were perceived to have performed admirably throughout this crisis. Everything is above a 0, which is fantastic. But of these, around, I think, 3 or 4 of them were a little bit below the 5 mark and do represent opportunities for improvement, we believe. So that's the overall view. That's how we see it, how the organizations came through. Well done, and thank you to everyone who did participate. It was fantastic to have that participation. And I'm going to hand over to Josh to take us through 6 key insights, which we will focus on for the next hour. Right.
Great. Thank
Josh,
you very much.
you.
Thanks very much, Ian. Right, so folks, I'm going to take you through 6 of the sort of main insights we drew from the results of this diagnostic, and Wendy and I are going to talk through these. So out of these results, the first sort of key insight that struck us from the results was that where people are drawing conclusions about what you care about is that they look at where you're spending your time, what you're giving your attention to, and whose agenda you choose to prioritize. So looking at the specific reasons given as evidence of a primary concern for people, those were the top 5 reasons. And what comes out of this is that where leaders were seen to make people the primary concern, it was because they did practical things, like putting people's health and safety first. Regardless of what the impact was on results, they demonstrated personal concern for the individual. They stayed in contact to find out how people were doing under the circumstances, took a genuine interest in people's welfare during the crisis, and absolutely kept them informed to the best of their ability. Now, what was striking about this was that these issues were far more important to people than job or income security. Wendy, if I could just bring you in on this for some comment as to how this connects to the framework.
Right, thanks, Josh. So if we go back to the insight, people draw conclusions about what you care about based on whose agenda you prioritize. In other words, whether you put your employees' agenda or your agenda first. So the question is really, what is an employee's agenda? I mean, what are people looking for from leadership? What are their needs, if you like? And from a legitimate leadership perspective, we believe that the following are the employees' primary concerns. It is, we want you to show concern for our personal circumstances. We want you to talk to us. And combined with disclosing information, we also want you to listen. We want you to consult and listen. We want you to coach. We want you to empower and grow us. We want you to hold us accountable, both positively and negatively. And we want you to invest time in building a team. So what is reflected on this slide here is that those were exactly the reasons given when people said, positive response, management has really made people primary during this crisis. It is because leadership have delivered on those employee needs. And clearly, spending time and giving attention to these things, none of those are actually going to save your business. Or are they? And from a legitimate leadership perspective, we fundamentally believe that if you want people to care for your business, first and foremost, you need to care for them. So I think it is an absolute tribute to the client organizations here that despite the immense pressure that leaders must have been under to do what needs to be done to get the business secured, actually they were able to find the time to actually focus on and deliver on their employees' agenda.
Yeah, Wendy, I mean, I'd just like to make a comment here. You know, I mean, I did a lot of interviews during the exercise, and particularly with 5 clients from really diverse industries, and all having a very different experience in terms of how the crisis affected their business. And what was remarkable about this is where people gave these reasons as, you know, this is why I think that management are demonstrating care and concern, was just the level of gratitude that people expressed in talking to us about what leaders were doing for them, and the level of willingness that they spoke about in being prepared to help the organization through the crisis. And it really struck me in all of the interviews that I did. You know, just the generosity that this has the potential to unleash in people.
If I can just step in there and just share another kind of perspective from my side, is that it's almost more interesting what was not said than what was said. And Wendy, you did touch on this a little bit, but when you speak to leaders, there's the significant priority to save people's jobs, save the company. This is what I'm doing. And that's why I don't have time for people. I'm too busy saving the company. And in a sense, you know, they better be grateful for that. But it isn't what people notice. What people notice is the personal touch. I mean, I think obviously you have to save the jobs, you have to do that leadership part as well, but you cannot do that and forget to also make a connection with people. I think really, really important.
Well, I guess the point here, Ian, on that is saving the business is in the leader's interests. But doing these things for people is absolutely firmly very much the employee agenda. And for me, that was what was remarkable and striking about the conversations we had with people in these organizations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
So folks, moving on to the second insight, which I'm just going to pop up on the screen, and it has to do very specifically with trust. And what was interesting about the results is it was absolutely clear that trust is not a function of circumstance, situation, or position in the hierarchy. It is most certainly a function of intent. Now, you know, what we mean by that is trust did not vary, you know, on the basis, for example, of how the organization fundamentally was doing during the crisis, nor did it vary significantly based on where you were in the hierarchy. So whether you were in a leadership role or not in a leadership role, or whether you were further to the sort of upper end of the hierarchy or the lower end of the hierarchy. Interestingly, trust also didn't vary significantly by industry either. But what did account for improvements in trust was most definitely these things. And they were all about communicating with employees, again, concern for employee welfare, the degree to which leaders were perceived to be honest and transparent, giving time to things that were important to people, and interestingly, also giving people new responsibilities and being prepared to trust them. Wendy.
Yeah. Right. So on this one, I want to go right the way back to the initial seminal research into trust in management in the gold mines. And what that research said was, if trust has improved over a 12-month period, it's due to one thing only, and that is that management has demonstrated that they have a genuine concern with the well-being of their people. So if we go back to our 2 questions, the first one was, what has management made important to themselves, or what have they focused on during this time, people through to results? Second question we asked was, so has trust changed at all? Has it improved a little or a lot? Has it stayed the same, or has it deteriorated a little or a lot? And obviously what we found was, A, by and large, people did believe that people came first at this crisis. And not unsurprisingly then, so trust in management increased. There is absolutely then, if you like, a correlation between those two things. But the other thing that I think was very interesting about this particular insight was, again, from a legitimate leadership point of view, we believe that people trust managers or leaders who care about them. But further to that, that people trust those who trust them. In other words, there are two criteria for legitimacy. The one is care and the other is growth. And what has come through very interestingly in these results here is the piece around growth, in other words, empowering people during this time, now comes through in the findings.
Yeah. So I mean, let's just talk about this, in terms of the third insight that we picked up on. And that was, when you look at these two criteria, that leaders have most definitely, on the whole, been significantly more successful, interestingly, in demonstrating care and compassion than they have necessarily been in using the crisis to empower and bring out the best in their people. So, coming back to...
of course. 1 second.
Coming back to what Wendy's just said about the fact that there are these two criteria for legitimate power, and they are care and growth, that when we look at the diagnostic results, on the care criterion, leaders have performed exceptionally well. On the growth criterion, on the other hand, leaders have not performed quite as well. And, leaders delivered well on the care criterion because they were doing things like putting people's health and safety first, being available, paying attention to employee concerns, delivering on information that helped employees make better decisions and providing support. But not to the same extent have they delivered on the growth criteria in terms of capitalizing on the opportunity which any crisis provides to empower people and to enable them the best that they can be. So perhaps just to hone in very specifically on the empowerment criteria. Empowerment did actually arise. But what was fascinating about this was that empowerment arose more so by default rather than necessarily by deliberate design. And it was interesting that this was primarily enabled by the necessitated move to remote working arrangements. And so, just to perhaps explain this for a moment, because managers and employees who are typically in the office together were no longer physically present, the experience on both ends were, where empowerment was improving, it was on the basis of, I'm not in the office with the manager, I'm not in the office with my people anymore. And so I am still nevertheless trusted to just get on with the job and deliver what is required. And so this we found was brought about mostly by the necessitated transition to remote working, and this created the conditions for some improvements in empowerment. Wendy, a comment on this from you?
Yes, so going to the screen here, essentially I think the position we come from is to say that unless you deliberately choose empowerment over control, you will in fact revert to control. And I'm just going to use a couple of examples, not necessarily pertaining to the crisis here for a moment. But I did a piece of work many years ago in a crisp manufacturing business where the factory manager unbelievably devolved decision-making authority down the line. And I said to him, how did you render this miracle? And he said, I moved my office out of the factory and, you know, across into the admin building, because it was just too easy for people to stick their head around the office door and say, hey, should we change the flavor on line 9? Okay. Secondly, it's occurred to me that I've done more empowerment in the last few weeks than I've done in a long time, and then simply achieved that miracle by moving to the UK. But the point here really is that you can't wait for something like that to actually empower people. And in the crisis that we're going through currently, there is no doubt that almost, if you like, people are looking to management to step in, to take control, to make the decisions. They're looking for saviors, and it's very tempting as a manager to want to be one of those saviors. And we believe that the price you pay when you do that is simply too high. Because when you take control, what you do is you kill initiative, you kill creativity, you kill a sense of ownership, you kill accountability in your business. So it's a tough thing to do, but if you can just put it up there, Josh. That has been essentially our recommendation to participating companies in the organization, that if they want to actually take this crisis as an opportunity, in fact, to empower people more, this is what they should be doing. Okay. And the last one I would just comment on, because it's an interesting one. I mean, what we have seen is that in client organizations, as a result of the crisis, they've thrown all sorts of controls out the window. So we had one client that got everybody to come in and just take anything they wanted out of their office to work from home. And hold your breath. They didn't even keep a register. They said in the past, this would have been a monumental project plan with God knows 5 different people signing off on the removal of a chair. So people have also done incredible things in short periods of time in this crisis. I mean, we have a client in the platinum industry who built a hospital in 8 weeks. So this is the opportunity we really see here, is to say, when you're through this, please, whatever you do, resist the temptation to put back all of this bureaucracy into your business. And secondly, stop or reduce all the detailed reporting. It literally does not add value.
I mean, I just like to sort of add, there were sort of 2 thoughts I had about this, Wendy. I mean, the one is to add perhaps another example of doing away with controls to empower people during the crisis. And I mean, I had one of our clients that I interviewed who took all of their normal sick leave policies in terms of requirements for sick notes and who you have to get permission from, and threw them out the window. And instead said, we trust you to decide whether you're well enough to come to work. These are the requirements. If you're sick, if you have any symptoms of any kind, rather stay at home. You know, you don't need to ask us for permission to do this. Just do it. And the interesting product of this post the crisis, when looking at their results, was they looked at this policy and said, is there really any compelling reason why we need to reintroduce these policies? Answer, no. Because what we've asked our people to do is to be what they are, which is responsible adults. And that's exactly what they've done during the crisis. So what reason do we have to reimpose these policies? Answer, none. So we're not going to. We're going to leave it exactly as it is. And what was interesting for me was that, you know, where there were significant increases in trust, in other words, the organizations that I interviewed and spoke with where trust had increased much more, interestingly, it was partly because that they had actually done a better job of delivering on this empowerment criterion. And it just, I think, underscores the importance of the fact that there are 2 criteria for legitimacy, not 1 criteria for legitimacy. And when you deliver on both, this is what really unlocks the granting of trust to leadership. that was certainly struck me in the results.
Can I make a suggestion?
Thank you, John.
We've covered 3 insights. Can we not just have a pause at this point and ask if anybody would like to ask a question or make a comment?
I was about to say, Wendy, there is actually a question, and I was also going to ask you, Josh, if you could please just take the presentation down so we can see you.
Yes.
The question is, Wendy, wouldn't explanation be also that during times of crisis, managers tend rather more to avoid any kind of risks? And empowerment is, in fact, a risk for leaders. So is this not what is pushing back against empowering people?
I think that's a convenient excuse.
I mean, I think
let's turn this around, because again, it was interesting that some client organizations also said, you know, historically, before we made any decision, we buried ourselves in data and information, and only when we had done the big paralysis and analysis piece, we finally make a call. We didn't have time to do that in the crisis. So we became infinitely more decisive. And so again, the issue is saying, maybe we don't need so much information. Maybe we can make a call, take a risk, if you like, with less data at hand.
Can I throw something into the mix, Wendy? Sorry, it's Joe here, yeah. Babcock here. Hi.
Yeah.
Just picking up on the risk point and being in a crisis, yeah. Firstly, for me, risk is where people develop and grow. If you don't expose people to risk and allow people to mistakes, they don't develop and grow. You actually need to allow them to do that. Point 2 for me is, yeah, if you're empowering managers to manage, you've got to allow them to be exposed to that risk and manage, because otherwise they're not empowered. So which really brings you back to, why have a dog and bark yourself, to use one of my favorite phrases. I don't know how that resonates with the rest of you, but you know, it's about empowering people.
Yeah. Right, Mark looked as if he wanted to say something.
Yeah, thanks very much, if I may. You know, I completely buy into and support the concept of empowering people, particularly in a time of a crisis, because, I mean, just basic logic says if you rely on only a handful of individuals to be key decision makers, you really limit just how effective you can be. But at the same time, I think what's really important is that leadership needs to determine what is it that staff can't do for themselves. So if I can just make it practical during the time of the crisis, you know, things that we did, for argument's sake, like we designed an internal chat room that people could phone into exclusive for our staff, with a doctor who would actually answer queries, questions telephonically during the course of the day, or by sort of mail, you know, in after hours. Now that's something that the staff on their own could not necessarily do organizationally wide. But then we started to determine, you know, what it was that, you know, where were the areas equally that staff could necessarily exercise autonomy of decision making. What we did do, though, which is something I fear that from the conversation that we didn't necessarily give sufficient recognition to, is people run scared during the crisis. That's the reality. I ran scared. Even as, you know, CEO of the organization, I ran scared because we were dealing with a pandemic that we had never really dealt with before. So recognizing that there is fear, one of the best ways to deal with fear, I believe, is to still keep structures in place rather formally. So meetings, in fact, if anything, rather than having our weekly exco meeting, we started to have, in the first few weeks of the pandemic, we actually had a daily call-in that everybody literally for 2 minutes would phone in and just give us issues that were concerning them, and if they needed advice, consulting, support, whatever, they could get it. But we made it, you know, and then as the pandemic extended, so we ensured that our meetings moved from once a day to once every 2 days, once every 3 days. But what we did from a leadership perspective is we gave certainty, we gave some stability to, let's talk about, to the reporting type structures. What we did do is we changed the content. Now, instead of going through our old traditional, you report on financials and then you report, we put financial reporting, quite frankly, somewhat aside and simply said, okay, the crisis is one of, have we got enough money to support all the programs? And we'd have once a week a discussion around finances. But for the rest of the time, it was changing the priorities around which we spoke. But we still kept the structure of meetings very, very much in place. And we made sure that equally, management at our sites kept their structures very much in place. We just found that that created a sense of stability that people could at least, align to, rather than necessarily just saying, hey guys, you're all hell of a competent individuals, go out and come up with your own solutions.
Mark, I think one can't disagree with what you're saying. I think you're absolutely right. The fine line you need to walk is, are you, by doing things for people, are you creating dependence or independence? And to avoid this idea that actually at the end of the crisis, people are more dependent than when they went in. I had the, it turns out, real privilege of moving to the UK to take over as MD of a business 1 week after the financial crisis of 2008 hit. And the 2 years of 2009 and 2010 for me represent the biggest opportunity for growth I've ever had. But I didn't feel unsafe, if that makes sense. And I think that's what you are getting at. And that is a real, in that way, there can be a real opportunity. But we certainly have seen people who have become more dependent rather than less dependent during the crisis. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. Josh, can we move to the fourth insight?
Yes, shall we? Okay, so the fourth insight came from looking at what is it that respondents in the diagnostic valued in terms of what leaders did. And what was very interesting was that leaders have most definitely valued hardworking leaders with a personal touch over visionaries and strategists. Now, it's not to say that being visionary or being a good strategic thinker is not needed in a crisis. But looking at the themes that came out of the question, what really did leaders do that was exceptional? There were 5 very obvious themes, and they were connecting and checking in on a personal level and demonstrating genuine concern for people. I had in particular, just one particular interview has just stood out again and again and again. It was with one of the clients who spoke about a manager at a very senior end of the organization who had said, I do not know how this leader did it, but this leader maintained a 30-minute check-in once a week with 7 direct reports. And we would have all completely forgiven this leader for foregoing that. And they didn't. They absolutely made it work. So to the second point, being available and giving people support, communicating openly, honestly, and transparently, disclosing information, really listening to what employees had to say. The fourth one was interesting, and that was that leaders were really commended for being in the trenches with their people. Now specifically, what we mean by this is that, where the circumstances of COVID, gave rise to a sort of legitimate reason for leaders to say, well, look, I really would like to be with my people, but the restrictions and the circumstances are not really allowing me to be. The leaders who really stood out said, I'm going in anyway. So, whether it was a case of the leader could feasibly work from home or work remotely, but the work needed to be done on site, the leaders who stood out literally went into work anyway and stood shoulder to shoulder with their people. And that really stood out. And it was a sort of overall theme of leaders who really were seen to be working incredibly hard during the crisis, going above and beyond the expectation their people held from them, and taking on and being responsible for new things that ordinarily wouldn't have formed part of their responsibilities. Wendy,
Yes.
what are your insights in terms of this?
Right, I've only got a fairly quick comment to make here, but I saw an interesting chat from Dave Evans, so I think we'll move on to that after I've made the point. What this is really saying is not that it's not important to have the insight, the vision, the right kind of business strategy to help your organization survive or even thrive during this time. But it's hugely significant, I think, that what this is saying is this will not be what you are remembered for or revered for during this crisis. So think about this in this way. What are you going to actually revere your leadership for? Managing to restore your income back to 100% quickly, or actually being deeply concerned about a difficult personal circumstance that either you personally or your family have suffered as a result of the crisis. And I believe what that person will take with them into the future is the latter, not the former.
Yeah.
Dave, can we ask you to state your question or comment? You're on mute. Sorry, Dave, you're still on mute.
Right, I was battling to hit it for some reason, sorry about that. In a lot of senses, you covered in your comment the sort of thing that was at the back of my mind. I think the nature of this crisis is so totally different. As somebody said a couple of minutes ago, we haven't had one of these for a century and none of us was around then. If the crisis is there's been a tsunami or the sails have gone or the machinery's out of date, we have some experience of how you handle that and what the strategy aspects of addressing it ought to be. But this one is so completely different. The character of it is so intangible. And I think that's why these aspects that we're talking about now are so much more important. And having a 5-year strategy is irrelevant, related to the crisis.
David, if I can just share a personal kind of experience of this. 2008 financial crisis wasn't a health crisis. It was a financial crisis. I happen to have lots of friends who work in investment banking, and they happen to be in London, where people were being made redundant. It was a terrible time. But what strikes me is the thing that people spoke about was not that their companies were making retrenchments or what strategies they were using to get out of it. The thing that they spoke about was the way that people had been made redundant. And those who hadn't been made redundant would talk about in the pubs, my manager did X, my manager, well, you know what happened in our company, and it did lead me to believe they weren't talking about, well, what is the strategy of our business? And, maybe that's important, or possibly not.
Yes, it's an echo of what we're saying, essentially. It's not just the same perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. The fifth insight.
Yes, okay. So let me just put it up. So the fifth insight was, for me, one of the most interesting things to come out of this. And it is very simply that superhero leadership works. And so is spreading them. Now, what we sort of mean by this is that in answering the question, can you think of, who really stood out for you during this crisis? There were sort of two distinct sort of pools of response. There were some organizations in which you could just see there was one or two leaders that were repeatedly referred to by respondents to the diagnostic. And there were other organizations where actually the number of people were many. In other words, it was more a case of, well, here are 3 or 4 people. Other people said it's been really difficult to single people out because everybody's done such a fabulous job. And, or the list of names was really long. And what was interesting about this was this didn't really impact whether or not trust changed, or whether there was a significant difference in trust as to whether there were few leaders mentioned or many leaders mentioned. So whether you have just a few leaders as standouts or many leaders as standouts, either works. But we absolutely do have, from our point of view, a strong preference for which ultimately is better and more sustainable. And I'm most definitely going to ask Wendy to comment on this.
Well, I think the green box more or less makes the comment that I would make, and that is that if you want sustainable organizational excellence, this isn't going to happen by having 2 or 3 superheroes at the top of the organization. You have to cultivate legitimate leaders at every level in the line of command. I think one of the most rewarding or positive findings in one of our client organizations who has implemented legitimate leadership throughout the hierarchy is that when we asked for standout leaders, many were mentioned, and in particular, many first-line managers were mentioned. Mm-hmm. And I saw that as real success, if you like. And the second comment, and it's allied to this, is just what is leadership all about? Ultimately, it's about cultivating excellent leaders. Yeah. So if you're saving the day, but actually you haven't built competent leaders underneath you, I don't think you're really fulfilling your leadership role.
Josh, maybe this is a question for you. Paul, and please take the video down again for a second, or the presentation. And it's not something that I've considered before this minute. Fortunately, I don't have to answer. Were these standout leaders during the crisis also standout leaders before the crisis?
Personal experience? Yes. So when I say yes, my personal experience of a few clients I've been working with over a number of years, it has been a case of steadily growing the number of leaders that align to the criteria. And I think, and certainly if I think to the diagnostics that I personally interviewed, it was almost like the culmination in terms of people who were mentioned of a sustained effort to grow the number of leaders in that business who are seen to be legitimate and have the trust of their people. And so I think it's feasible to sort of conclude that, a crisis may reveal leaders that are otherwise not seen to be such. But I think where the organizations have really succeeded at this, it's because they've deliberately gone about doing so. And I mean, one of them that really stands out was a smaller organization in our sample, but I sort of met them 4 years ago. And there were really only 2 leaders in the business, and it was the 2 owners. And, 4 years later, they have, 15 to 18 people in leadership roles, and almost every single person was mentioned. And I don't think this happens by accident. I think this happens because you deliberately work at enabling and cultivating leaders who align with these criteria.
My experience, certainly from the interviews that I was party to, was it was a bit of a mix. In other words, those who were very good before remained very good and maybe even were better. But very positively, there were sort of new names that came up in this crisis. I think it did, again, if people were given the freedom to do so, did bring forth, and again, perhaps accelerated bringing forth some good leadership into the business.
Another question, and then we'll move on to the last insight. But from Luke, to what extent do you think there is confirmation bias in the results of the research? i.e., you polled clients that are engaging with and implementing the framework. What would have happened if the people you had asked had not been legitimate leadership clients? And I mean, the obvious answer is the results would have been much worse, Luke. I mean, obviously. But let's stay away from the obvious one. Wendy, what is your thought on
I
that?
mean, let me just say, and this is going to sound like a bit of a punt, certainly in at least one of our clients, the view expressed was, God, if this crisis had hit us before legitimate leadership, believe me, we would have had a very different response. Oh, shit.
We can still hear you, Wendy.
No, we can't.
Right?
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
Wendy's back.
Oh, sorry, I just totally lost signal. I mean, I do want to go back to, this was a bias sample in the sense of we only spoke to client organizations who've already been working with this framework for probably at least.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Wendy is in the UK. They don't have as reliable internet access as South Africa. So, we'll have to deal with that. But
I challenge that, Ian. I'm in the UK and I can hear you. Okay. All right. I've got an 80 meg line and you are coming through 100%. So don't just cast everybody with the same brush.
I joke, but Wendy did say to me, how am I going to make sure that I have a good internet connection? I said, Wendy, you're going to be in the UK. As long as you're not in some 17th century cottage in the middle of a field, you'll be fine. And then next time she spoke to me, she said, I've rented a 17th century cottage in the middle of a field.
I'm in a field as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, Wendy, you're back.
So we deliberately only spoke to client organizations who's worked with this framework for 2 years. I mean, for me, the very sort of important insight really was you can imagine in a crisis that the temptation to throw legitimate leadership out of the window must have been high. And again, I come back to it's an absolute tribute that leaders didn't. Yeah.
But is that from the point that Wendy, people felt really congruent, they really believed in that framework and saw what it can do? And it brings me back to this thing around risk. And people who develop and grow, if they are exposed to that risk and allowed to make mistakes and develop and grow for them.
Yeah. Well, and I think, Joe, even more obviously, people have been convinced because of their exposure to the framework that more important than anything else is that you focus on your people, make your people the priority, and demonstrate genuine concern for them.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Luke, it is worth mentioning that the people in the sample of the 282, nearly 150 of them have never been exposed to legitimate leadership because they're not in leadership roles in those businesses. And, and so a lot of these insights come from people who, whilst the organization has been doing this, they haven't been brainwashed to the same extent that the leaders have been. Right. Josh, we need to get to the last insight and then wrap up.
Let's do that. So the final sort of insight is, what is it that people are looking for from leadership? And I mean, the outcome here was absolutely clear. And it is those things, people are looking for communication, compassion, they're looking for empowerment, flexibility, visibility, and appreciation from their people. So, in terms of those, with communication, and I mean, Wendy, I'd like you to just sort of chime in here as we go through these, because I'd like to just work through some of our thoughts on this, as well as sort of what people are asking for. So, communication here is sort of not too much, but honest, human, short, and interactive have been the things to come out of the crisis. And, listen more. Trust us with financial information has been one of the key themes to come out of this. The second thing is, in terms of compassion and connection, check in with people, care, be approachable, supportive, and show empathy. And the interesting thing again was consistency in one-to-ones, with a focus on the person as a human being and enabling them to maintain their contribution during this time has really, really stood out and what people want more of. Empowerment, less micromanagement. You don't need to check up on us quite so much. We don't need as many meetings, and far less reporting would be more helpful. So really enabling people to take ownership and accountability by handing over control and creating systems and structures that enable them to take ownership and accountability, rather than as experienced as checking up on them. In terms of flexible working arrangements, don't go back to normal. Allow flexibility and ownership in different ways of working. And I think there was really quite a strong theme here for a need to help people to work remotely, but perhaps even more importantly, to help leaders to lead remotely. And there has, from our experience of talking to clients and various people about, it's been quite a big focus on the issue of just how do you work remotely? And perhaps an issue for the future is, that's fine, but how do you actually lead successfully remotely? In terms of visible leadership, be visible, be available, especially if you're working remotely with your team. And often this requires an increased investment in time. And it's something that I think you deliberately need to work at making work, and making time to watch the game, spending time with people, understanding what it is they need to contribute so that you can give people those things, and making sure that when you're with your people, you are in fact giving them your full attention. And then finally, recognition and appreciation cannot be overstated. And to be deliberate in looking for opportunities to express genuine gratitude and appreciation for what people have done and are continuing to do to make a contribution to the organizations they work in. And to not, because we're working remotely, or a lot of us are, fall victim to the out of sight, out of mind sort of situations. So take opportunities and look for opportunities to recognize people for a careful, consistent contribution, and single out people who are going the extra mile. Yeah.
Thanks, Josh.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
We are at the end of the session, and there are another couple of slides. One of them just highlights, or summarizes the 6 insights, and then a final one provides some recommendations. And we'll send those presentations out to everybody, so that you can kind of review them on your own and reflect on them. But I would like to use just the last 3 or 4 minutes to say, from a client perspective, is there anything we've missed? Is there anything that was really valuable about being a part of this? And then we'll say goodbye to everyone. Is there any client who's willing to go on record? Mark would like to say.
Yeah, please. And up front, I have to admit my obvious bias, quite frankly, because we looked at legitimate leadership as a method to create an internal culture long before there were any crises involved. And I just quickly like to make just 2 comments. Number one, legitimate leadership is a way of life. It's in fact a belief system. It's not necessarily just a management tool, yet another management tool. It is a value system, and it needs to be enforced and reinforced constantly. In any organization, you get churn of staff, and therefore I think it's really critical that if this culture is to be retained, there has to be on a regular basis, certainly at least annually, a revision and a reinforcement of this. And I think one of the greatest things leadership can do in an organization is to recognize that there is this culture that needs to be ingrained in the organization, and to in fact take leadership decisions when it's, when setting annual budgets, or you say set a budget aside to ensure that legitimate leadership is not just a once-off event. The very important thing that we found, very briefly, and I know I'm very long-winded and I apologize, is that the framework that legitimate leadership gave us was one that was really very easy for us to just perpetuate, to continue. So all we did in our organization, which was to be typically involved in child rearing, child development, etc. And then the crisis hit us and we had to quickly move to food security. It wasn't too difficult to change direction of the organization because we had the principles of legitimate leadership to help guide and direct us there. Teammanship, all the issues we just discussed now. How leadership wasn't necessarily just, me sitting and saying, we will move in this direction. It was by agreement. That was part and parcel of, what legitimate leadership had taught us. So we moved from very much a pyramid structure with the, CEO at the top of the pyramid to a structure which really had a CEO at the bottom of the structure in support of the team. Now that I can only credit legitimate leadership with. So my belief is that this is, again, to reiterate, it's not just a once-off management tool that you take out of the box when there's a crisis. This is a way of life that needs to be ingrained on a constant and regular basis at all levels within the organization. And I've only got praise and compliment, to say, to the legitimate leadership team who inculcated this and has kind of perpetuated the enlightened approach to management. So really just to end on that note, many thanks indeed.
Yeah. Thank you. I would just like to say, because Mark has not said so, he is the CEO of Africa Tikkun, whom many people in South Africa will know. Perhaps the people in the UK and Europe who are on the call won't have done so. But what Africa Tikkun has done during this crisis is close to a miracle. They have turned their different centers into distribution points, and they have literally fed millions of South Africans during this incredibly difficult time. So as an organization, they deserve a great depth of gratitude, I think, from everyone in this country. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. It's really brilliant to hear that some of the work that we do makes a difference. And I am grateful for that feedback. Josh, thank you for your time. Wendy, thank you for your time. We'll see each other later in the day, I know. Thank you, everyone who's been on the call. If you have any further questions or thoughts or insights, please get in touch. There was one question, and I think that it was from David Evans, if I can go back, which said, are you any intent in legitimate leadership addressing the new normal of remote working? David, yes, and we'll certainly get in touch with you. We do have ideas on that, and in response to what clients have been asking for. So thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful Friday. Have a fantastic weekend, and I look forward to seeing you at one of our future webinars. Much appreciated.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks very much. Great session. Well done.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.